In June 1954, Guatemala's elected president stepped before a radio microphone and announced that he was resigning. Rebel soldiers were closing in. Aircraft circled above the capital. Radio broadcasts warned that a massive invading army was advancing, but much of it was an illusion. The rebel force numbered only a few hundred men, backed by the CIA and amplified through psychological warfare. Behind the Cold War language of communism stood another struggle, over land, railroads, ports, and one of the most powerful American corporations in Latin America. The United Fruit Company had built an empire around a cheap yellow fruit. When President Jacobo Arbenz tried to redistribute some of its unused land to poor farmers, that empire pushed back. Bananas did not overthrow Guatemala's government alone, but the wealth, influence, and political fear surrounding them helped make the coup possible. Because long before Guatemala fell, the banana empire had already learned how to buy land, finance invasions, silence workers, and decide who was allowed to rule. Long before bananas became a symbol of tropical abundance, they looked almost nothing like the smooth, seedless fruit found in supermarkets today. Wild bananas were packed with large, hard seeds and contained only small amounts of edible flesh. Thousands of years ago, in New Guinea and parts of Southeast Asia, early farmers began selecting rare plants that produced softer fruit with fewer seeds. Over generations, they transformed a difficult wild plant into a dependable food source. Because many cultivated bananas could no longer reproduce normally through seeds, farmers propagated them by cutting shoots from existing plants. This meant that every new banana plant was closely connected to the one before it. The fruit gradually spread through Southeast Asia, South Asia, across the Indian Ocean, and into Africa. In many societies, bananas and plantains were not sweet snacks. They were boiled, roasted, fermented, dried, or ground into flour, staple foods that helped entire communities survive. For centuries, however, bananas remained mostly a local food. The reason was simple: they spoiled too quickly. Grain could survive for months. Sugar, coffee, and spices could cross oceans without becoming worthless. But bananas began ripening almost as soon as they were cut from the plant. A delayed wagon, a damaged road, or a slow ship could turn an entire harvest into brown waste before it reached a buyer. That weakness made bananas one of the most difficult fruits to sell across long distances. To transform them into a global commodity, businesses would have to control every hour between plantation and supermarket. They needed farms beside railway lines, trains connected directly to ports, fast ships crossing the Caribbean, and distribution networks ready the moment the fruit arrived. Selling bananas would demand far more than growing them. It would require control over land, transportation, labor, and governments. In other words, it would require an empire. The transformation began in 19th-century Costa Rica, where American entrepreneur Minor Cooper Keith became involved in building a railway through the jungle. The line was supposed to connect the country's coffee-growing interior with the Caribbean coast, but construction became a human catastrophe. Workers battled torrential rain, mudslides, disease, suffocating heat, and some of the most brutal terrain in Central America. Thousands were recruited from Jamaica, China, Italy, and elsewhere, while illness and exhaustion destroyed entire labor crews. Along the unfinished railway, Keith planted bananas. The fruit could be harvested beside the tracks, carried directly to the port of Limon, and shipped north before it spoiled. Soon bananas were earning money, even while the railroad itself struggled to survive. What began as a transportation project quietly became something much larger, a new commercial system in which railways, plantations, and ports all existed to move one fragile fruit as quickly as possible. When Costa Rica could no longer meet its financial obligations, Keith negotiated a deal that transformed his position completely. In exchange for completing the railway, he received vast land concessions, long-term control over the line, and extraordinary influence over the country's Caribbean trade. The railway had been built in the name of national development, but it now served a private banana empire. This model would soon spread across Central America. Foreign companies offered governments what they desperately needed: railroads, ports, jobs, and access to American markets. In return, they demanded land, tax exemptions, and contracts written heavily in their favor. The infrastructure looked modern, but its purpose was often narrow. These railways were rarely designed as national transportation systems. They were built like private arteries, carrying bananas from company land to company ports, while bypassing communities that produced no export profit. Tracks connected plantations to company ports, while nearby towns remained isolated. Export terminals moved fruit efficiently, while local communities lacked roads, schools, or hospitals. Governments gained development, but they also became dependent on the corporations controlling it. By the end of the 19th century, the banana trade was no longer a side business attached to railroads. It had become the main source of power. In 1899, Minor Cooper Keith's interests merged with the Boston Fruit Company, creating the United Fruit Company. The new corporation controlled nearly every stage of the journey: plantations, railways, ports, ships, warehouses, and distribution networks in American cities. This vertical system solved the banana's greatest weakness: time. Fruit could be cut while still green, rushed onto trains, loaded onto fast ships, and ripened close to its destination. A crop once trapped by geography could now travel thousands of miles. United Fruit did not simply sell bananas. It built a machine designed to move them faster than they could rot. United Fruit expanded rapidly across Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, Panama, Colombia, Cuba, and other tropical regions. Its ships became known as the Great White Fleet. Its railway lines cut through forests. Its communication systems connected plantations, ports, and corporate offices across the Caribbean. To American consumers, this looked like progress. Bananas became cheap, familiar, and available throughout the year. They appeared in breakfast bowls, children's lunches, desserts, and advertisements filled with bright tropical colors. But in Latin America, the company earned a darker name: El Pulpo, the octopus. Its plantations were only one part of its power. Its arms reached into railways, shipping, banking, communications, and government offices. United Fruit did not need to officially rule a country. It only needed to become too important for that country to resist. The political system created around this trade gave birth to a phrase still used today: the Banana Republic. American writer O. Henry popularized it in his 1904 book, Cabbages and Kings, inspired partly by his time in Honduras. The fictional country he described was unstable, dependent on a single export, and easily manipulated by foreign businesses. The story was fiction, but the structure was real. Honduras had the perfect climate for bananas, yet its government lacked money, infrastructure, and strong control over parts of the country. Foreign fruit companies offered railways, employment, and access to American markets. In exchange, they received enormous land grants, tax exemptions, and political influence. The country's economy became tied to one fragile crop, and to the corporations that controlled nearly every route carrying it abroad. One of the men who understood this system best was Samuel Zemery, later known as Sam the Banana Man. He had first made money by buying overripe bananas at American ports and selling them quickly before they became worthless. But Zemery soon realized that the greatest profits did not come from fruit alone. They came from controlling the political conditions surrounding it. In 1911, he helped support the return of exiled leader Manuel Bonilla to power in Honduras. Weapons, a ship, and armed men were organized for the campaign. Bonilla's forces entered the country, the existing government collapsed, and a new administration favorable to Zemery's interests took control. In return, his business gained stronger protection, valuable land, and favorable tax concessions. A fruit merchant had helped finance the overthrow of a government. Zemery's intervention revealed a dangerous new reality. Banana companies no longer had to wait for governments to protect their interests. They could help create governments that would. Presidents depended on export revenue. Military leaders looked for foreign support, and corporations demanded officials willing to defend plantations, crush labor unrest, and preserve favorable contracts. The fruit itself remained cheap in American markets, but the political cost behind it kept rising. In countries tied to banana exports, a company could threaten to close plantations, redirect shipping routes, or withdraw investment. Thousands of jobs and much of the national income could disappear almost overnight. That gave foreign businesses power far beyond ordinary commerce. The banana trade was no longer simply shaping economies. It was beginning to determine which leaders survived and which governments were allowed to fall. The banana plantations created thousands of jobs, but life inside the empire was harsh and tightly controlled. Workers cleared forests, dug drainage canals, carried heavy stalks, and loaded fruit under intense tropical heat. Disease was common, injuries were frequent, and agricultural chemicals were used on a massive scale. In many regions, laborers lived in company housing, bought food from company stores, and depended on company doctors. Some were hired through contractors, allowing corporations to avoid direct responsibility for wages, accidents, or poor conditions. A plantation could become an entire world controlled by one employer. The company owned the land, the railway, the housing, and often the only route out. And when workers demanded better treatment, the company could ask the national government to protect its property and suppress resistance. That system exploded into violence in Colombia in 1928. Thousands of workers on United Fruit plantations went on strike, demanding basic protections, formal contracts, safer conditions, compensation for injuries, better housing, regular cash wages, and an end to abusive contractor arrangements. Their demands were not calls for revolution. They were requests for rights many industrial workers elsewhere had already begun to claim. United Fruit resisted, and as the strike spread, the Colombian government sent troops into the banana zone. Tension grew around the railway town of Ciénaga, where workers and their families gathered to hear news of negotiations. The company feared disruption. The government feared disorder and foreign pressure. Then, on the night of December 5th, soldiers surrounded the crowd. What followed became one of the darkest events in the history of the banana trade. In the early hours of December 6th, the Colombian army opened fire. Workers, women, and children had gathered near the railway station in Ciénaga when soldiers ordered the crowd to disperse. Moments later, gunfire tore through the square. The exact number of people killed remains disputed. Official reports claimed a limited death toll, while witnesses, diplomats, and later investigations suggested the number may have been far higher. Bodies were allegedly removed quickly, and public memory became clouded by denial, fear, and silence. The massacre later entered literature through Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, where the dead are carried away and the event is erased from official history. But the message to workers across the region was unmistakable. When corporate profits were threatened, the army might defend the company before defending its own citizens. While workers were being shot in banana-growing regions, the fruit's image in the United States became more cheerful than ever. Banana companies published recipe books, funded advertising campaigns, and taught consumers how to recognize the perfect stage of ripeness. Bananas appeared in breakfast bowls, children's meals, desserts, and brightly colored supermarket displays. The Chiquita banana character turned the fruit into a playful symbol of tropical abundance. But the violence behind that abundance remained far away. American shoppers saw a cheap yellow fruit. They did not see the private railways, company-owned ports, exhausted laborers, political deals, or soldiers guarding plantations. This distance was essential to the business. The suffering happened where bananas were grown. The innocence was manufactured where they were sold. And that illusion helped the empire grow even larger. By the middle of the 20th century, United Fruit had become one of the most powerful foreign corporations in Guatemala. Its influence stretched far beyond banana plantations. The company controlled vast areas of land and benefited from crucial transportation links, including railway access and the Caribbean port through which much of the country's trade passed. Yet large portions of its property remained uncultivated. At the same time, millions of rural Guatemalans had little or no land of their own. This extreme inequality became a central problem for President Jacobo Arbenz, who believed the country could not modernize while its best farmland remained concentrated in a few hands. His solution was land reform. But once his government moved against unused corporate estates, Guatemala was no longer challenging only wealthy landowners. It was challenging the octopus itself. In 1952, Arbenz introduced an agrarian reform program aimed at breaking Guatemala's deep concentration of land. Large estates could keep the property they actively cultivated, but unused land could be expropriated and redistributed to poor farmers. Compensation would be paid through government bonds based on the value landowners had declared for tax purposes. That detail created a crisis. United Fruit had reported relatively low values for parts of its property to reduce taxes. When the government used those same figures to calculate compensation, the company suddenly argued that the land was worth far more. In other words, Guatemala was valuing the property according to the numbers United Fruit itself had reported. The company now faced the consequences of declaring its land cheap for tax purposes and expensive when the government attempted to purchase it. To Arbenz, the reform was about national sovereignty and economic survival. To United Fruit, it threatened both its property and a business model built on controlling enormous reserves of land. The dispute was no longer local. It was moving toward Washington. United Fruit responded by turning the land dispute into a political emergency. The company had deep connections in Washington and worked aggressively to portray Arbenz's reforms as evidence of communist expansion in the Western Hemisphere. This message arrived at the perfect moment. The Eisenhower administration already viewed left-wing movements in Latin America with intense suspicion, and Guatemala's growing ties to labor organizers and communist activists seemed to confirm its fears. Yet Arbenz was not simply a Soviet puppet. His government was a nationalist reform movement, trying to reduce inequality and modernize the country. But Cold War anxiety made nuance almost impossible. Corporate interests, American security fears, and Guatemala's internal political conflicts became fused into one narrative. A dispute over unused farmland was now being presented as a direct threat to the United States. Inside the United States government, those fears became policy. The CIA developed Operation PB Success, a covert plan to remove Arbenz from power. A rebel force, led by Carlos Castillo Armas, was trained outside Guatemala and prepared for invasion. But the operation was never designed to win through military strength alone. Its real weapon was fear. Aircraft carried out limited attacks. A secret radio station broadcast exaggerated reports of rebel victories and described a massive force advancing toward the capital. In reality, the invasion consisted of only a few hundred men. Yet Guatemalan officers began to believe that the United States would continue escalating until Arbenz fell. The illusion of overwhelming power mattered more than the rebels themselves. By convincing the military that resistance was hopeless, the CIA turned psychological pressure into a weapon of regime change. On June 27, 1954, the pressure finally broke the government. Arbenz resigned in a radio address, insisting that Guatemala had become the victim of foreign intervention. Soon after, Castillo Armas took power. United Fruit had not acted alone, and bananas were not the only reason for the coup. Cold War fears, military disloyalty, opposition from Guatemalan elites, and American strategic calculations all mattered. But the company's land dispute helped transform Guatemala into a crisis in Washington. Its lobbying and political connections encouraged officials to interpret reform as revolution. A democratically elected government had challenged the power of a corporation. The corporation helped convince a superpower that the government itself was dangerous. That was the true scale of the banana empire. It could turn a conflict over land into regime change. After Arbenz fell, Guatemala's land reform was dismantled. Opposition parties were suppressed, and the country entered a period of deep political instability. The coup did not create every conflict that followed, but it destroyed one of the strongest democratic attempts to address inequality through elections. For many Guatemalans, the message was clear. Peaceful reform could be reversed if it threatened powerful domestic elites or foreign interests. Over the following decades, the country descended into civil war, military repression, disappearances, and mass violence. United Fruit had protected its immediate interests, but Guatemala paid the long-term price. The overthrow became one of the clearest examples of how a multinational corporation, working through the fears and ambitions of a superpower, could help shape the fate of a smaller nation. The banana corporations had influenced presidents, controlled railways, broken strikes, and survived political scandals. But beneath their plantations, an enemy was spreading that could not be bribed, threatened, or removed by force. For much of the early 20th century, the dominant export banana was not the Cavendish found in supermarkets today. It was Gros Michel, also called Big Mike. The variety was ideal for international trade because its thick skin and dense flesh survived rough handling during shipping. Companies planted it across enormous plantations, often using genetically similar plants reproduced from shoots. That uniformity made production faster and more predictable. It also created a biological trap. Once a disease capable of attacking one plant entered a plantation, nearly every other plant was vulnerable. The same system that made the banana empire efficient had quietly made it dangerously fragile. The threat arrived through a soil-borne fungus known as Fusarium wilt, or Panama disease. It entered banana roots, blocked the plant's vascular system, and slowly cut off the flow of water. Leaves yellowed, wilted, and collapsed. Entire plantations began to die. Once the fungus contaminated the soil, it could survive for years, making the land almost useless for the same variety. Companies responded by abandoning infected fields, clearing new forests, and planting Gros Michel elsewhere. But the disease kept following. By the middle of the 20th century, the export industry built around Big Mike was collapsing. The banana empire had mastered ships, railways, advertising, and political influence, yet it could not defeat a microscopic organism, spreading silently beneath the ground. The industry survived by replacing Gros Michel with another variety, the Cavendish. It was not identical in taste or texture, but it resisted the strain of Panama disease, destroying Big Mike, and could still endure long-distance shipping. Plantation owners rapidly replanted entire regions, supermarkets adjusted their supply chains, and advertisers presented the new banana as if nothing important had changed. Most consumers barely noticed. The yellow fruit on the shelf looked familiar, and the global system kept moving. But the solution contained the same weakness as the disaster before it. The Cavendish was also reproduced through shoots, creating vast plantations of nearly identical plants. The banana companies had escaped one crisis, but they had not changed the structure that caused it. They had simply replaced one vulnerable monoculture with another. Today, the Cavendish dominates the global export market. Its uniform size, predictable ripening, and durable skin make it ideal for supermarkets and long-distance shipping. But that consistency comes at a cost. Because most Cavendish plants are genetically similar, a disease that can kill one may threaten millions. A newer strain of Fusarium wilt, known as Tropical Race 4, has already spread through several banana-producing regions. Once it enters the soil, it can remain there for years and is extremely difficult to contain. The industry once believed Cavendish had solved the crisis that destroyed Gros Michel. Now the same nightmare is returning. The modern banana still depends on vast monocultures, centralized supply chains, and the demand for identical fruit. History is not repeating by accident. The system itself was never truly changed. But disease is only one threat facing the modern banana industry. Plantation workers in many producing countries still confront low wages, chemical exposure, insecure contracts, and pressure from powerful exporters. Many large export plantations rely heavily on pesticides and fungicides to protect genetically uniform crops from disease, insects, and cosmetic damage. In some regions, these chemicals are applied repeatedly, creating risks for workers, nearby communities, soil, and water. Chemicals may be sprayed repeatedly across plantations, affecting workers, nearby communities, soil, and water. Meanwhile, supermarkets demand fruit that looks almost identical, bright yellow, evenly shaped, and free from visible marks. Bananas that fail these cosmetic standards may be rejected, even when they are safe to eat. The result is a system that hides environmental and human costs behind a perfectly clean appearance. The banana may look simple, but producing that simplicity requires constant control. The strange part is that the banana's low price still makes the entire system look harmless. In many supermarkets, imported bananas cost less than fruit grown much closer to home. That is possible only because the true expenses are pushed elsewhere, onto workers earning low wages, governments providing favorable conditions, communities living near heavily treated plantations, and ecosystems cleared for large-scale agriculture. Consumers rarely see those costs. They see a convenient fruit with its own natural packaging, sold all year at a price that seems almost impossible. And in a way, it is impossible. The banana is not cheap because it is simple to produce. It is cheap because more than a century of corporate power, political influence, standardized farming, and hidden sacrifice has been built into every stage of its journey. And yet, almost none of this history is visible in the supermarket. The banana rests beside apples and oranges, appears in school lunches, and is peeled without a second thought. There is no label describing the railway concessions, military interventions, labor conflicts, or forests cleared to keep it cheap. That invisibility may be the banana empire's greatest achievement. It separated the product from the conditions that produced it. Violence remained on distant plantations. Political influence disappeared inside contracts and government offices. Disease remained hidden beneath the soil. By the time the fruit reached American consumers, every sign of conflict had been replaced by sweetness, convenience, and bright yellow skin. The banana did not become ordinary because its history was simple. It became ordinary because the system behind it learned how to make that history disappear. Behind that ordinary appearance is a supply chain built around precision. Bananas must be harvested while green, transported before they ripen, stored under controlled conditions, and delivered within a narrow window. Plantations, railways, ports, ships, warehouses, and ripening facilities must work almost like parts of a single machine. A delay in one place can destroy the value of fruit thousands of miles away. That pressure explains why banana companies sought control over more than farming. They needed influence over transportation, labor, land, and trade itself. The modern banana is therefore not simply something grown in tropical soil. Its size, color, durability, and ripening behavior reflect more than a century of decisions made for international commerce. The fruit may be biological, but the banana found in supermarkets was shaped by an industrial system. The old banana empire did not simply disappear. Its methods became less visible. Modern producers still depend on enormous plantations, tightly controlled shipping networks, standardized fruit, and countries whose export economies rely heavily on foreign buyers. Millions of people also depend on the industry for wages, trade, and food, which makes the story more complicated than a simple battle between villains and victims. Bananas created employment, opened transportation routes, and connected distant markets. But they also concentrated extraordinary power in the hands of companies capable of influencing laws, labor conditions, land ownership, and national politics. The names of the corporations may change, and the ships may become faster. But the central question remains the same. How much power should any private industry possess when entire communities and countries depend on the product it controls? Today, the banana still looks harmless. It has no wrapper, no warning label, and no visible sign of the violence, disease, and political power hidden behind its journey. But beneath its yellow skin lies the story of railways cut through jungles, workers shot for demanding basic rights, governments manipulated by foreign corporations, and entire economies built around a fruit that could rot within weeks. The banana never carried a rifle. It never signed a contract. It never ordered a coup. But the hunger for land, profit, and control surrounding it did all three. So the next time you peel one open, remember that you are not simply holding a piece of fruit. You are holding the final, polished remains of an empire.